I am telling this story in the first person, though I am in no way connected with it, because I do not want to pretend to the reader that I know more about it than I really do. The facts are as I state them, but the reasons for them I can only guess, and it may be that when the reader has read them, he will think me wrong. No one can know for certain. But if you are interested in human nature, there are few things more diverting than to consider the motives that have resulted in certain actions. It was only by chance that I heard anything of the unhappy circumstances at all. I was spending 2 or 3 days on an island on the north coast of Borneo, and the district officer had very kindly offered to put me up. I had been roughing it for some time, and I was glad enough to have a rest. The island had been at one time a place of some consequence, with a governor of its own, but was so no longer, and now there was nothing much to be seen of its former importance except the imposing stone house in which the governor had once lived, and which now the district officer, grumblingly because of its unnecessary size, inhabited. But it was a comfortable house to stay in, with an immense drawing-room, a dining-room large enough to seat 40 people, and lofty, spacious bedrooms. It was shabby, because the government at Singapore very wisely spent as little money on it as possible. But I rather liked this, and the heavy official furniture gave it a sort of dull stateliness that was amusing. The garden was too large for the district officer to keep up, and it was a wild tangle of tropical vegetation. His name was Arthur Lowe. He was a quiet, smallish man in the later 30s, married with 2 young children. The Lowes had not tried to make themselves at home in this great place, but camped there like refugees from a stricken area, and looked forward to the time when they would be moved to some other post where they could settle down in surroundings more familiar to them. I took a fancy to them at once. The D.O. had an easy manner and a humorous way with him. I am sure he performed his various duties admirably, but he did everything he could to avoid the official demeanour. He was slangy of speech and pleasantly caustic. It was charming to see him play with the 2 children. It was quite obvious that he had found marriage a very satisfactory state. Mrs. Lowe was an extremely nice little woman, plump, with dark eyes under fine eyebrows, not very pretty, but certainly attractive. She looked healthy, and she had high spirits. They chaffed one another continually, and each one seemed to look upon the other as immensely comic. Their jokes were neither very good nor very new, but they thought them so killing that you were obliged to laugh with them. I think they were glad to see me, especially Mrs. Lowe, for with nothing much to do but keep an eye on the house and the children, she was thrown very much on her own resources. There were so few white people on the island that the social life was soon exhausted, and before I had been there 24 hours, she pressed me to stay a week, a month, or a year. On the evening of my arrival, they gave a dinner party to which the official population, the government surveyor, the doctor, the schoolmaster, the chief of constabulary, were invited. But on the following evening, the 3 of us dined by ourselves. At the dinner party, the guests had brought their houseboys to help, but that night we were waited on by the Lowes' 1 boy and my travelling servant. They brought in the coffee and left us to ourselves. Lowe and I lit cheroots. "You know that I've seen you before," said Mrs. Lowe. "Where?" I asked. "In London, at a party. I heard someone point you out to somebody else. In Carlton House Terrace at Lady Castellan's." "Oh? When was that?" "Last time we were home on leave. There were Russian dancers." "I remember. About 2 or 3 years ago. Fancy you being there." "That's exactly what we said to one another at the time. said Lowe, with his slow, engaging smile. We'd never been at such a party in our lives. It made a great splash, you know, I said. It was the party of the season. Did you enjoy it? I hated every minute of it, said Mrs. Lowe. Don't let's overlook the fact that you insisted on going, Bee, said Lowe. I knew we'd be out of it among all those swells. My dress clothes were the same I'd had at Cambridge, and they'd never been much of a fit. I bought a frock specially at Peter Robinson's. It looked lovely in the shop. I wished I hadn't wasted so much money when I got there. I never felt so dowdy in my life. Well, it didn't much matter. We weren't introduced to anybody. I remembered the party quite well. The magnificent rooms in Carlton House Terrace had been decorated with great festoons of yellow roses, and at one end of the vast drawing-room a stage had been erected. Special costumes of the Regency period had been designed for the dancers, and a modern composer had written the music for the 2 charming ballets they danced. It was hard to look at it all and not allow the vulgar thought to cross one's mind that the affair must have cost an enormous amount of money. Lady Castellan was a beautiful woman and a great hostess, but I do not think anyone would have ascribed to her any vast amount of kindliness. She knew too many people to care much for anyone in particular, and I couldn't help wondering why she had asked to such a grand party 2 obscure and quite unimportant little persons from a distant colony. Had you known Lady Castellan long? I asked. We didn't know her at all. She sent us a card and we went because I wanted to see what she was like, said Mrs. Lowe. She's a very able woman, I said. I dare say she is. She hadn't an idea who we were when the butler man announced us, but she remembered at once. Oh, yes, she said. You're poor Jack's friends. Do go and find yourselves seats where you can see. You'll adore Leafar. He's too marvellous. And then she turned to say, how do you do to the next people? But she gave me a look. She wondered how much I knew, and she saw at once that I knew everything. Don't talk such nonsense, darling, said Lowe. How could she know all you think she did by just looking at you, and how could you tell what she was thinking? It's true, I tell you. We said everything in that one look, and unless I'm very much mistaken, I spoiled her party for her. Lowe laughed, and I smiled, for Mrs. Lowe spoke in a tone of triumphant vindictiveness. You are terribly indiscreet, Bee. Is she a great friend of yours? Mrs. Lowe asked me. Hardly. I've met her here and there for 15 years. I've been to a good many parties at her house. She gives very good parties, and she always asks you to meet the people you want to see. What do you think of her? She's by way of being a considerable figure in London. She's amusing to talk to, and she's nice to look at. She does a lot for art and music. What do you think of her? I think she's a bitch, said Mrs. Lowe, with cheerful but decided frankness. That settles her, I said. Tell him, Arthur. Lowe hesitated for a moment. I don't know that I ought to. If you don't, I shall. Bee's got her knife into her all right, he smiled. It was rather a bad business, really. He made a perfect smoke ring and watched it with absorption. Go on, Arthur, said Mrs. Lowe. Oh, well. It was before we went home last time. I was due in Selangor, and one day they came and told me that a white man was dead in a small town a couple of hours up the river. I didn't know there was a white man living there. I thought I'd better go and see about it, so I got in the launch and went up. I made inquiries when I got there. The police didn't know anything about him, except that he'd been living there for a couple of years with a Chinese woman in the bazaar. It was rather a picturesque bazaar, tall houses on each side, with a boardwalk in between, built on piles on the riverbank, and there were awnings above to keep out the sun. I took a couple of policemen with me, and they led me to the house. They sold brassware in the shop below, and the rooms above were let out. The master of the shop took me up 2 flights of dark, rickety stairs, foul with every kind of Chinese stench, and called out when we got to the top. The door was opened by a middle-aged Chinese woman, and I saw that her face was all bloated with weeping. She didn't say anything, but made way for us to pass. It wasn't much more than a cubby-hole under the roof. There was a small window that looked on the street, but the awning that stretched across it dimmed the light. There wasn't any furniture except a deal table and a kitchen chair with a broken back. On a mat against the wall, a dead man was lying. The first thing I did was to have the window opened. The room was so frowsty that I retched, and the strongest smell was the smell of opium. There was a small oil lamp on the table and a long needle, and of course I knew what they were there for. The pipe had been hidden. The dead man lay on his back with nothing on but a sarong and a dirty singlet. He had long brown hair, going grey, and a short beard. He was a white man, all right. I examined him as best I could. I had to judge whether death was due to natural causes. There were no signs of violence. He was nothing but skin and bone. It looked to me as though he might very likely have died of starvation. I asked the man of the shop and the woman a number of questions. The policeman corroborated their statements. It appeared that the man coughed a great deal and brought up blood now and then, and his appearance suggested that he might very well have had TB. The Chinaman said he'd been a confirmed opium smoker. It all seemed pretty obvious. Fortunately, cases of that sort are rare, but they're not unheard of. The white man who goes under and gradually sinks to the last stage of degradation. It appeared that the Chinese woman had been fond of him. She'd kept him on her own miserable earnings for the last 2 years. I gave the necessary instructions. Of course I wanted to know who he was. I supposed he'd been a clerk in some English firm or an assistant in an English store at Singapore or Kuala Lumpur. I asked the Chinese woman if he'd left any effects. Considering the destitution in which they'd lived, it seemed a rather absurd question, but she went to a shabby suitcase that lay in a corner, opened it, and showed me a square parcel about the size of 2 novels put together wrapped in an old newspaper. I had a look at the suitcase. It contained nothing of any value. I took the parcel. Lo's cheroot had gone out, and he leaned over to relight it from one of the candles on the table. I opened it. Inside was another wrapping, and on this, in a neat, well-educated writing, "To the district officer, me as it happened," and then the words, "Please deliver personally to the Viscountess Castellan, 53 Carlton House Terrace, London, SWW." That was a bit of a surprise. Of course I had to examine the contents. I cut the string, and the first thing I found was a gold and platinum cigarette case. As you can imagine, I was mystified. From all I'd heard, the pair of them, the dead man and the Chinese woman, had scarcely enough to eat, and the cigarette case looked as if it had cost a packet. Besides the cigarette case, there was nothing but a bundle of letters. There were no envelopes. They were in the same neat writing as the directions, and they were signed with the initial J. There were 40 or 50 of them. I couldn't read them all there, but a rapid glance showed me that they were a man's love letters to a woman. I sent for the Chinese woman to ask her the name of the dead man. Either she didn't know or wouldn't tell me. I gave orders that he should be buried and got back into the launch to go home. I told B. He gave her his sweet little smile. I had to be rather firm with Arthur, she said. At first he wouldn't let me read the letters, but of course I wasn't going to put up with any nonsense like that. It was none of our business. You had to find out the name if you could. And where exactly did you come in? Oh, don't be so silly, she laughed. I should have gone mad if you hadn't let me read them. And did you find out his name? I asked. No. Was there no address? Yes, there was, and a very unexpected one. Most of the letters were written on Foreign Office paper. That was funny. I didn't quite know what to do. I had half a mind to write to the Viscountess Castellan and explain the circumstances, but I didn't know what trouble I might be starting. The directions were to deliver the parcel to her personally, so I wrapped everything up again and put it in the safe. We were going home on leave in the spring, and I thought the best thing was to leave everything over till then. The letters were by way of being rather compromising. To put it mildly, giggled Mrs. Lowe, the truth is they gave the whole show away. I don't think we need go into that, said Lowe. A slight altercation ensued, but I think on his part it was more for form's sake, since he must have known that his desire to preserve an official discretion stood small chance against his wife's determination to tell me everything. She had a down on Lady Castellan and didn't care what she said about her. Her sympathies were with the man. Lowe did his best to tone down her rash assertions. He corrected her exaggerations. He told her that she'd let her imagination run away with her and had read into the letters more than was there. She would have done it. They'd evidently made a deep impression on her, and from her vivid account and Lowe's interruptions, I gained a fairly coherent impression of them. It was plain, for one thing, that they were very moving. I can't tell you how it revolted me, the way B gloated over them, said Lowe. They were the most wonderful letters I've ever read. You never wrote letters like that to me. What a damned fool you would have thought me if I had, he grinned. She gave him a charming, affectionate smile. I suppose I should, and yet God knows I was crazy about you, and I'm damned if I know why. The story emerged clearly enough. The writer, the mysterious J, presumably a clerk in the Foreign Office, had fallen in love with Lady Castellan, and she with him. They had become lovers, and the early letters were passionately lyrical. They were happy. They expected their love to last forever. He wrote to her immediately after he had left her and told her how much he adored her and how much she meant to him. She was never for a moment absent from his thoughts. It looked as though her infatuation was equal to his, for in one letter he justified himself because she had reproached him for not coming to some place where he knew she would be. He told her what agony it had been to him that a sudden job had prevented him from being with her when he'd so eagerly looked forward to it. Then came the catastrophe. How it came, or why, one could only guess. Lord Castellan learnt the truth. He not merely suspected his wife's infidelity, he had proofs of it. There was a fearful scene between them. She left him and went to her father's. Lord Castellan announced his intention of divorcing her. The letters changed in character. J wrote at once asking to see Lady Castellan, but she begged him not to come. Her father insisted that they shouldn't meet. J was distressed at her unhappiness and dismayed by the trouble he had brought upon her, and he was deeply sympathetic because of what she was enduring at home, for her father and mother were furious. But at the same time it was plain that he was relieved that the crisis had come. Nothing mattered except that they loved one another. He said he hated Castellan. Let him bring his action. The sooner they could get married, the better. The correspondence was one-sided. There were no letters from her, and one had to guess from his replies what she said in them. She was obviously frightened out of her wits, and nothing that he could say helped. Of course, he would have to leave the Foreign Office. He assured her that this meant nothing to him. He could get a job somewhere, in the colonies, where he would earn much more money. He was sure he could make her happy. Naturally, there would be a scandal, but it would be forgotten, and away from England, people would not bother. He besought her to have courage. Then it looked as though she had written somewhat peevishly. She hated being divorced. Castellan refused to take the blame on himself and be made respondent. She did not want to leave London. It was her whole life, and bury herself in some God-forsaken place on the other side of nowhere. He answered unhappily. He said he would do anything she wanted. He implored her not to love him less, and he was tortured by the thought that this disaster had changed her feelings for him. She reproached him for the mess they had got into. He did not try to defend himself. He was prepared to admit that he alone was to blame. Then it appeared that pressure was being brought to bear on Castellan from some high quarter, and there was even yet a chance that something might be arranged. Whatever she wrote made J, the unknown J, desperate. His letter was almost incoherent. He begged her again to see him. He implored her to have strength. He repeated that she meant everything in the world to him. He was frightened that she would let people influence her. He asked her to burn her boats behind her and bolt with him to Paris. He was frantic. Then it seemed that for some days she did not write to him. He could not understand. He did not know if she was receiving his letters. He was in an agony. The blow fell. She must have written to say that if he would resign from the Foreign Office and leave England, her husband was prepared to take her back. His answer was broken-hearted. "He never saw through her for a moment," said Mrs. Lowe. "What was there to see through?" I asked. "Don't you know what she wrote to him? I do." "Don't be such an ass, Bee. You can't possibly know." "Ass yourself. Of course I do. She put it up to him. She threw herself on his mercy. She dragged in her father and mother. She brought in her children. I bet that was the first thought she'd given them since they were born. She knew that he loved her so much that he was willing to do everything in the world for her, even lose her. She knew that he was prepared to accept the sacrifice of his love, his life, his career, everything for her sake, and she let him make it. She let the offer come from him. She let him persuade her to accept it. I listened to Mrs. Lowe with a smile, but with attention. She was a woman, and she felt instinctively how a woman in those circumstances would act. She thought it hateful, but she felt in her bones that in just that way would she herself have acted. Of course it was pure invention, with nothing but Jay's letter as a foundation, but I had an impression that it was very likely. That was the last letter in the bundle. I was astonished. I had known Lady Castellan for a good many years, but only casually, and I knew her husband even less. He was immersed in politics. He was Under-Secretary at the Home Office at the time of the Great Do, to which the Lowes and I had been invited, and I never saw him but in his own house. Lady Castellan had the reputation of being a beauty. She was tall, and her figure was good in a massive way. She had a lovely skin. Her blue eyes were large, set rather wide apart, and her face was broad. It gave her a slightly cow-like look. She had pretty pale brown hair, and she held herself superbly. She was a woman of great self-possession, and it amazed me to learn that she had ever surrendered to such passion as the letters suggested. She was ambitious, and there was no doubt that she was very useful to Castellan in his political life. I should have thought her incapable of indiscretion. Searching my memory, I seem to remember hearing years before that the Castellans were not getting on very well, but I had never heard any details, and whenever I saw them, it looked as though they were on very good terms with one another. Castellan was a big, red-faced fellow with sleek black hair, jovial and loud-voiced, but with little shrewd eyes that watched and noted. He was industrious, an effective speaker, but a trifle pompous. He was a little too conscious of his own importance. He did not let you forget that he had rank and wealth. He was inclined to be patronizing with people of less consequence than himself. I could well believe that when he discovered that his wife was having an affair with a junior clerk in the Foreign Office, there was a devil of a row. Lady Castellan's father had been for many years permanent Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and it would have been more than usually embarrassing for his daughter to be divorced on account of one of his subordinates. For all I knew, Castellan was in love with his wife, and he may have been teased by a very natural jealousy. But he was a proud man, deficient in humour. He feared ridicule. The role of the deceived husband is difficult to play with dignity. I do not suppose he wanted a scandal that might well jeopardize his political future. It may be that Lady Castellan's advisers threatened to defend the case, and the prospect of washing dirty linen in public horrified him. It is likely enough that pressure was brought to bear on him, and the solution to forgive and take his wife back if her lover were definitely eliminated may have seemed the best to adopt. I have no doubt Lady Castellan promised everything she was asked. She must have had a bad fright. I didn't take such a severe view of her conduct as Mrs. Lowe. She was very young. She was not more than 35 now. Who could tell by what accident she had become Jay's mistress? I suspect that love had caught her unawares, and that she was in the middle of an affair almost before she knew what she was about. She must always have been a cold, self-possessed woman. But it is just with people like that that nature at times plays strange tricks. I am prepared to believe that she lost her head completely. There is no means of knowing how Castellan discovered what was going on, but the fact that she kept her lover's letters shows that she was too much in love to be prudent. Arthur Lowe had mentioned that it was strange to find in the dead man's possession his letters and not hers, but that seemed to me easily explainable. At the time of the catastrophe, they were doubtless given back to him in exchange for hers. He very naturally kept them. Reading them again, he could relive the love that meant everything in the world to him. I didn't suppose that Lady Castellan, devoured by passion, could ever have considered what would happen if she were found out. When the blow fell, it is not strange that she was scared out of her wits. She may not have had more to do with her children than most women who live the sort of life she lived, but she may, for all that, not have wanted to lose them. I did not even know whether she had ever cared for her husband, but from what I knew of her, I guessed that she was not indifferent to his name and wealth. The future must have looked pretty grim. She was losing everything: the grand house in Carlton House Terrace, the position, the security. Her father could give her no money, and her lover had still to find a job. It may not have been heroic that she should yield to the entreaties of her family, but it was comprehensible. While I was thinking all this, Arthur Lowe went on with his story. I didn't quite know how to set about getting in touch with Lady Castellan, he said. It was awkward not knowing the chap's name. However, when we got home, I wrote to her. I explained who I was and said that I'd been asked to give her some letters and a gold and platinum cigarette case by a man who'd recently died in my district. I said I'd been asked to deliver them to her in person. I thought perhaps she wouldn't answer at all, or else communicate with me through a solicitor. but she answered all right. She made an appointment for me to come to Carlton House Terrace at 12 one morning. Of course it was stupid of me, but when finally I stood on the doorstep and rang the bell, I was quite nervous. The door was opened by a butler. I said I had an appointment with Lady Castellan. A footman took my hat and coat. I was led upstairs to an enormous drawing-room. "I'll tell her ladyship you're here, sir," the butler said. He left me, and I sat on the edge of a chair and looked round. There were huge pictures on the walls, portraits, you know. I don't know who they were by, Reynolds, I should think, and Romney, and there was a lot of oriental china and gilded consoles and mirrors. It was all terribly grand, and it made me feel very shabby and insignificant. My suit smelt of camphor, and it was baggy at the knees. My tie felt a bit loud. The butler came in again and asked me to go with him. He opened another door from the one I'd come in by, and I found myself in a further room, not so large as the drawing-room, but large all the same and very grand too. A lady was standing by the fireplace. She looked at me as I came in and bowed slightly. I felt frightfully awkward as I walked along the whole length of the room, and I was afraid of stumbling over the furniture. I can only hope I didn't look such a fool as I felt. She didn't ask me to sit down. "I understand you have some things that you wish to deliver to me personally," she said. "It's very good of you to bother." She didn't smile. She seemed perfectly self-possessed. But I had a notion that she was sizing me up. To tell you the truth, it put my back up. I didn't much fancy being treated as if I were a chauffeur applying for a situation. "Please don't mention it," I said, rather stiffly. "It's all in the day's work." "Have you got the things with you?" she asked. I didn't answer, but I opened the dispatch case I'd brought with me and took out the letters. I handed them to her. She accepted them without a word. She gave them a glance. She was very much made up, but I swear she went white underneath. The expression of her face didn't change. I looked at her hands. They were trembling a little. Then she seemed to pull herself together. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said. "Won't you sit down?" I took a chair. For a moment she didn't seem to know quite what to do. She held the letters in her hand. I, knowing what they were, wondered what she felt. She didn't give much away. There was a desk beside the chimney-piece, and she opened a drawer and put them in. Then she sat down opposite me and asked me to have a cigarette. I handed her the cigarette case. I'd had it in my breast pocket. "I was asked to give you this too," I said. She took it and looked at it. For a moment she didn't speak, and I waited. I didn't quite know if I ought to get up and go. "Did you know Jack well?" she asked suddenly. "I didn't know him at all," I answered. "I never saw him until after his death." "I had no idea he was dead till I got your note," she said. "I'd lost sight of him for a long time. Of course, he was a very old friend of mine." I wondered if she thought I hadn't read the letters, or if she'd forgotten what sort of letters they were. If the sight of them had given her a shock, she had quite got over it by then. She spoke almost casually. "What did he die of, in point of fact?" she asked. "Tuberculosis, opium and starvation," I answered. "How dreadful," she said. But she said it quite conventionally. Whatever she felt, she wasn't going to let me see. She was as cool as a cucumber, but I fancied, though it may have been only my fancy, that she was watching me, with all her wits about her, and wondering how much I knew. I think she'd have given a good deal to be certain of that. "How did you happen to get hold of these things?" she asked me. "I took possession of his effects after his death," I explained. "They were done up in a parcel, and I was directed to give them to you." "Was there any need to undo the parcel?" I wish I could tell you what frigid insolence she managed to get into the question. It made me go white, and I hadn't any makeup on to hide it. I answered that I thought it my duty to find out if I could who the dead man was. I should have liked to be able to communicate with his relations. "I see," she said. She looked at me as though that were the end of the interview, and she expected me to get up and take myself off. But I didn't. I thought I'd like to get a bit of my own back. I told her how I'd been sent for and how I'd found him. I described the whole thing, and I told her how, as far as I knew, there'd been no one at the end to take pity on him but a Chinese woman. Suddenly the door was opened, and we both looked round. A big, middle-aged man came in and stopped when he saw me. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I didn't know you were busy." "Come in," she said, and when he had approached, "This is Mr. Lowe, my husband." Lord Castellan gave me a nod. "I just wanted to ask you," he began, and then he stopped. His eyes had caught the cigarette case that was still resting on Lady Castellan's open hand. I don't know if she saw the look of inquiry in his eyes. She gave him a friendly little smile. She was quite amazingly mistress of herself. "Mr. Lowe comes from the Federated Malay States. Poor Jack Ormond's dead, and he's left me his cigarette case." "Really?" said Lord Castellan. "When did he die?" "About 6 months ago," I said. Lady Castellan got up. "Well, I won't keep you any longer. I dare say you're busy. Thank you so much for carrying out Jack's request." "Things are pretty bad just now in the FMS, if all I hear is true," said Lord Castellan. I shook hands with them both, and Lady Castellan rang a bell. "Are you staying in London?" she asked as I was going. "I wonder if you'd like to come to a little party I'm giving next week." "I have my wife with me," I said. "Oh, how very nice. I'll send you a card." A couple of minutes later, I found myself in the street. I was glad to be alone. I'd had a bad shock. As soon as Lady Castellan mentioned the name, I remembered. It was Jack Almond, the wretched bum I'd found dead in the Chinese house, dead of starvation. I'd known him quite well. It never struck me for a moment that it was he. Why, I dined and played cards with him, and we'd played tennis together. It was awful to think of him dying quite near me and me never knowing. He must have known he only had to send me a message, and I'd have done something. I made my way into St. James's Park and sat down. I wanted to have a good think. I could understand that it was a shock to Arthur Lowe to discover who the dead wastrel had been, for it was a shock to me too. Oddly enough, I also had known him, not intimately, but as a man I met at parties, and now and then at a house in the country where we were both passing the weekend. Except that it was years since I had even thought of him, it would have been stupid of me not to put two and two together. With his name, there flashed back into my memory all my recollections of him. So that was why he had suddenly thrown up a career he liked so much. At that time, it was just after the war, I happened to know several people in the Foreign Office. Jack Almond was thought the cleverest of all the young men attached to it, and the highest posts the diplomatic service had to offer were within his reach. Of course, it meant waiting. But it did seem absurd for him to fling away his chances in order to go into business in the Far East. His friends did all they could to dissuade him. He said he had had losses and found it impossible to live on his salary. One would have thought he could scrape along till things grew better. I remembered very well what he looked like. He was tall and well-made, a trifle dressy, but he was young enough to carry off his faultless clothes with a dash, with dark brown hair, very neat and sleek, blue eyes with very long lashes, and a fresh, brilliant colour. He looked the picture of health. He was amusing, gay, and quick-witted. I never knew anyone who had more charm. It is a dangerous quality, and those who have it trade on it. Often they think it enough to get them through life without any further effort. It is well to be on one's guard against it. But with Jack Almond, it was the expression of a sweet and generous nature. He delighted because he was delightful. He was entirely without conceit. He had a gift for languages. He spoke French and German without a trace of accent, and his manners were admirable. You felt that when the time came, he would play the part of an ambassador to a foreign power in the grand style. No one could fail to like him. It was not strange that Lady Castellan should have fallen madly in love with him. My fancy ran away with me. What is there more moving than young love? The walks together of that handsome pair in one of the parks in the warm evenings of early summer, the dances they went to where he held her in his arms, the enchantment of the secret they shared when they exchanged glances across a dinner table, and the passionate encounters, hurried and dangerous, but worth 1,000 risks. When at some clandestine meeting place, they could give themselves to the fulfillment of their desire. They drank the milk of paradise. How frightful that the end of it all should have been so tragic. "How did you know him?" I now asked Lowe. "He was with Dexter and Farmerlow. You know, the shipping people. He had quite a good job. He'd brought letters to the governor and people like that. I was in Singapore at the time. I think I met him first at the club. He was damned good at games and all that sort of thing, played polo. He was a fine tennis player. You couldn't help liking him." "Did he drink? Or what?" "No." Arthur Lowe was quite emphatic. "He was one of the best. The women were crazy about him, and you couldn't blame them. He was one of the most decent fellows I've ever met." I turned to Mrs. Lowe. "Did you know him?" "Only just. When Arthur and I were married, we went to Perak. He was sweet, I remember that. He had the longest eyelashes I've ever seen on a man. He was out quite a long time without going home. 5 years, I think. I don't want to use hackneyed phrases, but the fact is I can't say it in any other way. He'd won golden opinions. There were a certain number of fellows who'd been rather sick at his being shoved into a damned good job by influence, but they couldn't deny that he'd made good. We knew about his having been in the F.O. and all that, but he never put on any frills. I think what took me," Mrs. Lowe interrupted, "was that he was so tremendously alive. It bucked you up just to talk to him. He had a wonderful send-off when he sailed. I happened to have run up to Singapore for a couple of days, and I went to the dinner at the Europe the night before. We all got rather tight. It was a grand lark. There was quite a crowd to see him off. He was only going for 6 months. I think everybody looked forward to his coming back. It would have been better for him if he never had." "Why, what happened then?" "I don't know exactly. I'd been moved again, and I was right away north." "How exasperating! It is really much easier to invent a story out of your own head than to tell one about real people of whom you not only must guess the motives, but whose behavior, even at crucial moments, you are ignorant of. He was a very good chap, but he was never an intimate friend of ours. You know how cliqué Singapore is, and he moved in rather more exalted circles than we did. When we went north, I forgot about him. But one day at the club, I heard a couple of fellows talking, Walton and Kenning. Walton had just come up from Singapore. There'd been a big polo match." "Did Almond play?" asked Kenning. "You bet your life he didn't," said Walton. "They kicked him out of the team last season." I interrupted. "What are you talking about?" I said. "Don't you know?" said Walton. He's gone all to pot, poor devil." "How?" I asked. "Drink. They say he dopes too," said Kenning. "Yes, I've heard that," said Walton. "He won't last long at that rate. Opium, isn't it?" "If he doesn't look out, he'll lose his job," said Kenning. "I couldn't make it out," Lowe went on. "He was the last man I should ever have expected to go that way. He was so typically English, and he was a gentleman and all that. It appeared that Walton had travelled out with him on the same ship when Jack came back from leave. He joined the ship at Marseille. He was rather low, but there was nothing funny about that. A lot of people don't feel any too good when they're leaving home and have to get back to the mill. He drank a good deal. Fellows do that sometimes too. But Walton said rather a curious thing about him. He said it looked as if the life had gone out of him. You couldn't help noticing it, because he'd always had such high spirits. There'd been a general sort of idea that he was engaged to some girl in England, and on the ship they jumped to the conclusion that she'd thrown him over. "That's what I said when Arthur told me," said Mrs. Lowe. "After all, 5 years is a long time to leave a girl." Anyhow, they thought he'd get over it when he got back to work. But he didn't, unfortunately. He went from bad to worse. A lot of people liked him, and they did all they could to persuade him to pull himself together. But there was nothing doing. He just told them to mind their own business. He was snappy and rude, which was funny because he'd always been so nice to everybody. Walton said you could hardly believe it was the same man. Government House dropped him, and a lot of others followed suit. Lady Almond, the governor's wife, was a snob. She knew he was well-connected and all that, and she wouldn't have given him the cold shoulder unless things had got pretty bad. He was a nice chap, Jack Almond. It seemed a pity that he should make such a mess of things. I was sorry, you know, but of course it didn't impair my appetite or disturb my night's sleep. A few months later, I happened to be in Singapore myself, and when I went to the club, I asked about him. He'd lost his job all right. It appeared that he often didn't go to the office for 2 or 3 days at a time, and I was told that someone had made him manager of a rubber estate in Sumatra, in the hope that away from the temptations of Singapore, he might pull himself together. You see, everyone had liked him so much, they couldn't bear the thought of his going under without some sort of a struggle. But it was no good. The opium had got him. He didn't keep the job in Sumatra long, and he was back again in Singapore. I heard afterwards that you would hardly have recognized him. He'd always been so spruce and smart. He was shabby and unwashed and wild-eyed. A number of fellows at the club got together and arranged something. They felt they had to give him one more chance, and they sent him out to Sarawak. But it wasn't any use. The fact is, I think he didn't want to be helped. I think he just wanted to go to hell in his own way and be as quick as he could about it. Then he disappeared. Someone said he'd gone home. Anyhow, he was forgotten. You know how people drop out in the FMS? I suppose that's why, when I found a dead man in a sarong, with a beard, lying in a little smelly room in a Chinese house 30 miles from anywhere, it never occurred to me for a moment that it might be Jack Almond. I hadn't heard his name for years. "Just think what he must have gone through in that time," said Mrs. Lowe, and her eyes were bright with tears, for she had a good and tender heart. "The whole thing's inexplicable," said Lowe. "Why?" I asked. "Well, if he was going to pieces, why didn't he do it when he first came out? His first 5 years he was all right, one of the best. If this affair of his had broken him, you'd have expected him to break when it was all fresh. All that time, he was as gay as a bird. You'd have said he hadn't a care in the world. From all I heard, it was a different man who came back from leave." Something happened during those 6 months in London, said Mrs. Lowe. That's obvious. We shall never know, sighed Lowe. But we can guess, I smiled. That's where the novelist comes in. Shall I tell you what I think happened? Fire away. Well, I think that during those first 5 years, he was buoyed up by the sacrifice he'd made. He had a chivalrous soul. He had given up everything that made life worth living to him to save the woman he loved, better than anything in the world. I think he had an exaltation of spirit that never left him. He loved her still with all his heart. Most of us fall in and out of love. Some men can only love once, and I think he was one of them. And in a strange way, he was happy because he'd been able to sacrifice his happiness for the sake of someone who was worthy of the sacrifice. I think she was always in his thoughts. Then he went home. I think he loved her as much as ever, and I don't suppose he ever doubted that her love was as strong and enduring as his. I don't know what he expected. He may have thought she'd see it was no good fighting her inclination anymore, and would run away with him. It may have been that he'd have been satisfied to realize that she loved him still. It was inevitable that they should meet. They lived in the same world. He saw that she didn't care a row of pins for him any longer. He saw that the passionate girl had become a prudent, experienced woman of the world. He saw that she'd never loved him as he thought she loved him, and he may have suspected that she'd lured him coldly into making the sacrifice that was to save her. He saw her at parties, self-possessed and triumphant. He knew that the lovely qualities he'd ascribed to her were of his own imagining, and she was just an ordinary woman who had been carried away by a momentary infatuation and, having got over it, had returned to her true life. A great name, wealth, social distinction, worldly success, those were the things that mattered to her. He'd sacrificed everything, his friends, his familiar surroundings, his profession, his usefulness in the world, all that gives value to existence, for nothing. He'd been cheated, and it broke him. Your friend Walton said the true thing. You noticed it yourself. He said it looked as if the life had gone out of him. It had. After that, he didn't care any more, and perhaps the worst thing was that even with it all, though he knew Lady Castellan for what she was, he loved her still. I know nothing more shattering than to love with all your heart, than not to be able, however hard you try to break yourself of it, someone who you know is worthless. Perhaps that is why he took to opium, to forget and to remember. It was a long speech I had made, and now I stopped. "Oh, that's only fancy," said Lowe. "I know it is," I answered, "but it seems to fit the circumstances. There must have been a weak strain in him, otherwise he could have fought and conquered. Perhaps there is always a certain weakness attached to such great charm as he possessed. Perhaps few people love as wholeheartedly and as devotedly as he loved. Perhaps he didn't want to fight and conquer. I can't bring myself to blame him." I didn't add, because I was afraid they would think it cynical, that maybe if only Jack Almond hadn't had those wonderfully long eyelashes, he might now have been alive and well, minister to some foreign power, and on the high road to the embassy in Paris. "Let's go into the drawing-room," said Mrs. Lowe. "The boy wants to clear the table." And that was the end of Jack Almond.